I remember the first time I spent Christmas at my grandparents' house. My family lived further south than her, and so I wasn't used to the cold weather. Although we had visited her many times before, it was never a cold winter quite like it was that year. Not only that, this winter also happened to be the first time I had ever seen snow. This happened quite a long time ago, but there are some things that I remember very well. For some reason, I remember the front door to her house. It had windows in it, and I remember those windows being so frosted over that you couldn't even see anything out of them. It was the first time I'd ever experienced something like that. The Christmas tree was nice, and in the front window, which was also coated over with a layer of frost, all the aunts, uncles, and cousins were supposed to come over for Christmas. We were the only family that lived far away, so we were the only family who actually stayed at my grandparents' house. It was a pretty old house that was out in the country. I always enjoyed being there, even though it was so much different than what I was used to. For example, there wasn't a furnace in the house. Everything was warmed up with a coal-burning stove that was in the living room. I used to love that stove, and when I was really cold, I would go and stand right up against it to keep warm. I always slept on the upper floor. There were some old beds up there, and that was where the kids would sleep. My brother and I normally slept on a bunk bed that was up there, with him on the top and me on the bottom. It would always get really cold when we were there, so we always had a lot of blankets. It was so cold tonight, though, that despite the many blankets, I could not keep myself from shivering. Not being used to this sheer cold, I would keep waking up in the night. My brother and I were the only two who ever slept up there, so there was no one else around upstairs. It was Christmas Eve when this event happened. My brother was the type to always fall asleep pretty quickly. He had this loud snore which could even wake the dead. Fortunately for me, this night he was not doing that. I was still having a difficult time sleeping though. It was Christmas Eve after all, and we were all looking forward to Christmas morning. That was when it happened. Sure, it was dark in the room, but I was still able to see somewhat well. I could tell there was someone on the other side of the room. They were standing in the shadows, just staring at me. I only caught a glimpse of them standing there, and I could tell they were looking right into my eyes. I had no idea how long they had been standing there watching us. I jumped up and woke my brother up right away. I told him what was going on. He looked over, and he saw the man standing there too. That's when I knew that this was real and not just a dream or something. I went and turned on the lamp as fast as I could, but the moment it turned on, I found the room was empty. The man we had just seen standing there was already gone. I thought he couldn't have got out of the room by running that quickly. We would have at least heard him on the stairs, right? But he was completely gone. I remember my brother saying something like, "It must have been Santa Claus." There was no signs that anyone had broken into the house or anything. Every year to this day, my brother always talks about that Christmas ghost we saw during the holidays, but I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I grew up out in the country, and I've lived my whole life out there as well. I'm a country boy born and bred. When I get drunk on old Milwaukee, I listen to bluegrass music on the radio. Also when I smoke weed. I've always liked living in that way, and I even have someone else writing this story for me to share it with you, because I can't really write that well myself. I've always wanted to share the scariest thing that ever happened to me on Christmas, though. I could have stayed living with my parents for as long as I wanted to, really. Hell, my mom loved me, and she would have had me kept there forever, but you know how it is. I wanted to get out and get on my own. Start forming my own life. So I took a job working on a farm. The guy who owned the farm had an old building in the back that he left me to live in. It was set pretty far away from his home. It didn't have heating, but it did have water, electricity, and a stove, so I was able to have food. I had to use the stove to keep warm sometimes during the winter, but that didn't really bother me at all. Of course, in the winter times, there wasn't nearly as much work to do as there was during the summer. There were some things to do, but they were things that were done pretty quickly and done pretty easily. I ended up spending a lot of free time alone in that small building. The boys would come over and hang out and smoke some weed with me in the summertime, but they would rarely come over to hang out in the dead cold of winter. I lived a pretty simple life, but I was in love with it. I would have loved to go over to my mom's house for the holidays, but I really wasn't able to. There was some work on the farm every day, even if it was only a little bit. I had to be home during that time. I was a little bit sad about that, and I'm sure my mom was too, but there wasn't really anything to be done. On Christmas Eve, I decided to make myself a bit of Christmas dinner. The family that owned the farm had gone off to spend time with other relatives for the holidays. I think one of the other children had stayed home to do a bit of something as well. I noticed him outside while I was finishing up my chores. We didn't really talk though, since the two of us never really talked anyways. I never thought that he liked me very much actually, so I was a bit uncomfortable being alone with him on the farm. I remember it being so damn cold that night. There was a little bit of snow on the ground, but it wasn't that much. The sky was very overcast before I'd even gone in for the night. It seemed it might start snowing again at any time, and I was right. It soon did. I was beginning to think this was the perfect Christmas Eve I could spend by myself. By that time, I was ready to eat, the snow was falling pretty heavily, and the wind was blowing strongly, making really loud wailing sounds as the night went on. As I was eating, I suddenly heard a gunshot ring out. Now, some people hearing this might react differently than me when they hear a gunshot. They might be scared and get up and try to find where the noise came from. I didn't do anything like that though. Gunshots were pretty normal in the area I lived in. Then I heard another one though, which I paid much more attention to than the first one. I noticed where the second shot seemed to have come from, the direction of the farmhouse. That was really weird to me. I never thought the guy whose name was Josh would ever have anything to do with guns. Didn't seem like the type. I tried to put it out of my head though. Again, gunshots in that area were not really an uncommon sound. I just ate my meal and went about my own business. The wind was still blowing really hard, so I didn't hear anything else after the second gunshot. While I was eating, a little while after all the sounds had stopped, I heard something just outside my own little building. It sounded like some loud grunts or something like that. A few moments later, there was a loud thud right up against the door. It was extremely noisy, and I could see the door shake as it happened. I was startled. I heard some more movement outside my door, and then a more minor thud right after. After that, there weren't any more noises. I had no idea what was going on, of course, but I was scared. It wasn't like someone was knocking on the door. It was like something had been thrown against it, or something had fallen onto it. That's why I was so confused. I got up and walked over to the door. I was scared to open it, but I decided I had to. I took a moment of breath before I did. When I opened it, a body that was leaning against the door literally fell onto me. It took me a moment to realize that the person was Josh. He was in bad shape too, bleeding in several places. He'd obviously been shot. I had never seen something like this before, and I didn't know what to do. I pulled Josh inside the building and tried to ask him what happened. He was in shock though, and wasn't able to tell me much of anything, so that didn't really help. I decided I had to go to the main house and call an ambulance. Stupidly, I told Josh to wait there and ran out of the building. I was hustling and trying to make it to the house. As I did, I rounded around the house to the front and saw there was a truck parked there that I didn't recognize. I also saw the front door was wide open. I stopped for a moment, trying to figure out what was going on. The man in the car picked his gun up, although he didn't seem to be looking in my direction. Before he noticed me, I snuck around to the back of the home. Luckily, the back door was unlocked. The 911 dispatcher was going to send the police, so I had to tell them about the guy. Thankfully, I don't think he ever saw me. I don't know if he intended to hunt Josh down or what, but as soon as I got back inside, I locked things up until the police arrived. Fortunately, Josh survived and recovered, but it took a long while. The man was found and arrested, but I don't really know what happened to him after that. I remember my first time working Black Friday really vividly. You see, I didn't work in a retail store. I worked in a fast food restaurant. I'm not sure if I should mention which one it was. We were just as busy, though, as all the retail stores and malls. I mean, I seriously could probably tell you several stories that were extremely crazy, but one experience was way scarier to me than all the others. The day was going by quickly, so I was grateful for that. We were staying open late, to try and accommodate all the shoppers who must have had a hard day. When closing time was coming, I started to feel a lot better. The moment it hit time to close, I closed the doors on one side of the restaurant. I then went to lock the doors on the other side. As I was turning the lock, some guy just walked right up to the door. There were still some people in the dining room eating, but our procedure was to lock the doors at closing and not let anyone further in. We would open the door and let diners leave when they were done with their meal, but business was done for the day. I knew he'd seen me locking the door, but he decided to walk all the way up to it anyway. I never let anyone in after hours, but I could tell this guy was going to try and get in anyway. This happened from time to time, and although it did piss people off, nothing bad ever really happened from it. Come on, I made it last minute, he complained. I'm sorry, but we just closed, I informed him. I was about to turn and walk away from him, but I realized he was not going to go away that easily. At first, it was just him asking me over and over to be let inside. I didn't really know what to do. I figured the guy would just protest for a moment and then leave, but he quickly became very angry and began pounding on the door and demanding to be let in. I just looked at him and said, if there was any chance I was going to let you in before, that's definitely over now. The look the man gave me in response was terrifying. I could tell how furious he was. However, he was on the other side of the door, and there was no way I was letting him inside. After a little bit of huffing and puffing, he finally turned and walked away. Although it had been a little bit disturbing, it didn't seem like an event to take overly seriously. If you've ever worked in fast food or retail, you know that you have to deal with certain kinds of people. An angry, denied customer was one of them. I didn't really think it was that important, just another incident like those. After a while, I noticed that one of the families still eating was now done and needed to be let out the door. I got up to let them out. It was a family of 4. All the kids were in their upper teens. I let them out and locked the door again. A bit later, a man who was eating alone got up and bussed his table. He went towards the door and I went over to help him. I opened up the door to let the guy out. It all happened so quickly. No sooner had I opened the door than the angry customer from before came out of nowhere. He grabbed the door frame with one of his hands and tried to pull it open. Scared, both me and the inside customer tried to shut the door once more. This caused the outside customer to scream and pull his hand away. At first, his hand was caught inside the door and didn't seem to be going anywhere. I opened it just a little though, in order for him to tug his hand out. When he did, I was able to properly close it again and lock it. I don't think I've ever seen someone as pissed as he was in that moment. The man took a knife out of his pocket and began yelling and screaming that he was going to cut me open and kill me when I got off work. He was going to gut me. He kept yelling, screaming, and pounding on the door, trying his best to break in. This guy was definitely not strong enough to break down the door, though. When he realized this, he finally stopped. He showed me the knife once more and then ran off. The shock was overwhelming. Of course, the inside customer lost all interest in leaving at that moment. We had to call the police in order to feel any sort of protection. Nothing ever really came from it, though, and we never saw the guy again anyway. When I was 11 years old, I had a really scary experience. I didn't exactly believe in Santa Claus, but I knew my parents would sometimes put presents out right after they thought we went to sleep. Like any curious young kid would, I decided to get up in the middle of the night and go check out the Christmas tree. I wasn't going to open anything, I just wanted to see how many presents had mysteriously appeared. I snuck out of my room and confirmed that everyone else was asleep in bed. I then went to the stairs and quietly snuck down them. I got to the bottom. The tree was right in front of a big window. I was admiring how beautiful it looked. There were tons of presents as well. What I noticed behind the tree scared the crap out of me, though. There was a man just standing at the window, and he looked like he was trying to force it open. He didn't appear to see me. I backed off from the tree as slowly and quietly as I could. I kept my eye on the guy. He still hadn't noticed me. Going up the stairs, I was much quicker than I was going down. I ran into my parents' bedroom and told them someone was trying to break into our home. My dad grabbed up a baseball bat and went to check it out, while Mom called the cops. I heard some loud commotion downstairs, and my father yelling out threats. It wasn't long before the police arrived, but my dad had already chased the man away. They caught him a bit later. I didn't get in any trouble for going to check out the tree early, because I basically stopped a home invasion. One of my first proper jobs was working as an overnight security guard around Bury, which is a town just southwest of Cardiff in Wales. It was an easy job for the most part, and apart from a few close calls with some kids throwing big stones, I was more in danger of getting caught sleeping on the job than anything. That's because all the places I guarded were what you might call low-risk locations. I was a young lad barely out of school, with very little experience of the working world. My bosses weren't exactly in a rush to give me a ton of responsibility. As a result, I got all the sites with training wheels pretty much, essentially condemned buildings, vacant construction sites. I got all those kinds of jobs. Since there was next to nothing of value in any of them, there was next to no risk to myself or anything else guarding them. The only true incidents I had during my brief career in security were one of the knobheads I found trying to steal some copper wire, who ran as soon as I appeared, and one time 2 junkies were looking for a place to shoot up, who again ran away as soon as I emerged. There was a number 3, though, a bloke who tried to burn down the site I was guarding, who made a surprise appearance in my dreams for a few nights after the incident. It's number 3 that makes up the story I'm about to tell you today. I was on guard at an old special needs school that had been marked for demolition, a place called Greenways. Since the interior had been deemed unsafe to occupy, I was posted up in the porta-cab and situated in what used to be the school's car park. It had been another easy guard so far. Nothing even remotely eventful had happened for weeks on end. Out of nowhere one night, though, I suddenly heard a loud smashing coming from the school. Someone was either vandalizing the place or breaking in for some reason. Either explanation required a response on my part. I got up and walked out of my cab with my big mag light torch at the ready. I prepared to face off against whoever was doing this. Like I mentioned before, most people will just scamper immediately once they notice some kind of security guard present. I was not that worried, but I was a bit apprehensive. Once I saw whoever it was had smashed their way into the building via the old front doors. That meant I'd have to go inside myself and confront them. I had to find whoever had broken in and escort them off the premises after all. I wasn't one of those guards who took things personally though, or let stuff raise their blood pressure. I didn't exactly appreciate that this person was going to make me creep through the corridors like a horror movie. I shined my torch into each room, waiting for the inevitable jump scare, but the second I walked inside, I knew getting a bit of a fright was the least of my worries that night. Immediately, my nostrils were hit with the smell of petrol. It didn't take long to find the person either. We crossed paths in a corridor, maybe only a minute or so after I'd entered. In one hand, they were carrying a jerry can, and the other a big knife. Obviously, I wanted to know what he was doing spilling petrol all over the place, but the knife had my complete attention now. I started backing away, keeping my torch beam on him, and saying there was no need for anyone to get hurt. I knew once I was out I could call the police and do what have you, but bloody hell, seeing that blade had me absolutely shitting myself. From what little I could see of the man, I could tell the person in front of me was some sort of soldier bloke or something, maybe 30s or early 40s. Aside from the great big knife in his hands, he looked like a pretty average dude. He looked extremely surprised to see me. As I backed off, he yelled out to me, "Don't you dare try and stop me!" I told him I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. I said he should be very careful throwing this flammable liquid around like that though, especially in an old wooden building like this. Seems like a daft thing to say in retrospect, but I think I wanted to make it clear to the guy that I was on his side, so to speak. I wanted to make it look like I had his safety in mind too, even though all I could think about was getting out of there and calling 999. He didn't respond to my comment and kept dousing the walls and floor in petrol, then moving along the corridor. Once I was safely at the door, I called out once again, "You're not going to set this place on fire, are you?" I barely got the words out before he turned around and screamed so hard, his voice began to break. "You don't know what they did to me. You don't know what happened here. You don't know anything." This was echoing through the halls. What do you even say to something like that? I mean, honestly, if that were you, what would your response be to a guy screeching that at the top of his lungs? I couldn't think of a single thing at all. All my brain power was taken up wondering what was so terrible that he had to burn things down and make a huge fire. I never came up with anything. I knew the best thing for me to do was put as much distance between me and this bloke as possible. The last thing I heard him say as I was on the way out was something like Helena or some girl's name. The implication of what he said, I assumed the girl named Helena had gone through something terrible and not the guy himself. I needed to get away from this location and ask questions later. I didn't think the porta-cabin would be safe even. Not if he was planning on turning the old school into an blazing inferno. I ran all the way to the car park past the main gates, across the dual carriageway, then called the police from a bus shelter on the other side. I remember the 999 lady asking if I needed police, fire, or ambulance, and me saying I think I needed all three. I told them about the man and his knife, and how he seemed frantic, wanting to burn the school down. She said she'd send the police first, and to keep me on the line to keep an eye out for signs of smoke or flame. Eventually, I started to think maybe the bloke might have changed his mind or dropped his lighter or something after getting caught in the act. You'd think he would have hurried things along, but it was taking longer than I expected to see the flames. Once they took, though, they took quick, and the whole place went up in a blazing inferno that lit up the entire night sky. It was a big giant tinder box. The police arrived first, and obviously they were going nowhere near the burning building. And they stopped just outside the gates with their lights on, and I went over to meet them. They were just like me, really, in total disbelief. I tried to give them as good a description as I could, but I'd been so focused on the knife on the way out that the bloke's face was just a sort of blur in my memory. There wasn't much left for me to do but leave a message on my boss's answering machine, letting him know about the fire, and then going home for the night. Only problem was I was so full of adrenaline that I couldn't sleep at all. I stayed up until 5 or 6 in the morning. I couldn't get what he'd said before I left out of my mind. I ended up typing the name of the old special needs school into Google, and after a fair bit of sifting through articles, I found something quite shocking. I don't know if any of you have heard of the satanic panic that took place during the 80s. I certainly hadn't really until that night. In the late 80s, there was this sort of mental wave of satanic abuse accusations all across the US and UK. All at the same time and all roughly the same story. As you can imagine, there were all kinds of investigations. From what I read, almost each and every case was complete bollocks. Don't get me wrong, there were 1 or 2 cases that were semi-real and ended up with child abuse convictions or jail time. But the vast majority were made-up stories based on witch hunt-style accusations. One such scandal happened in the area. One kid who had been accused ended up in the care of social services. I found another article about an actual cult, which had been practicing the exact kind of satanic stuff described by people during the panic. 5 people went to prison over it, apparently. It was a real thing that you can look up for yourself and read about. I think that Helena girl he was talking about could have had something to do with that. About 5 years ago, when I was 16, I was living in western Pennsylvania in a heavily forested area. On this particular night, I was home alone with my younger brother. My mom was out at a baby shower, I think. I was in the kitchen making some dinner when I heard a knocking on the front porch. This wasn't a common knock like someone who might be waiting for me to open the door. It was more like a loud tapping close to one of the front windows. I paused and glanced around from where I stood in the kitchen. I could see the front door and one of the front windows. All the lights on the ground floor were on, and with it being dark outside, all I could see in the windows was a reflection of the inside of my living room. I waited for a few moments, but when the sound didn't come again, I just shrugged it off. I continued to concentrate on the stove. After maybe 5 minutes though, long enough for me to forget about the sound slightly, it repeated itself again. This time on the window at the far side of the house. "Mark?" I called out, thinking it may have been my brother playing around. There was no response. I walked over and peered outside with my hands pressed to the side of my face. I couldn't see anything. I turned as my brother came down the stairs. "Did you just hear something from around the back?" he said. I held up a finger to indicate we should pause and listen for a moment. Almost as if on cue, we heard footsteps calmly moving across the wooden floor of our wraparound porch. It was just outside the dining room wall. "There's someone out there," I said quietly, more angry than scared at this point. This was when we should have made sure all the doors were locked and the windows were sealed shut as well. We should have called out we were calling the police, but I was a stupid, headstrong kid and pissed off that someone was daring to mess with us. I remember my brother asking if the person outside was maybe trying to distract us. I was already at the gun cabinet, though. I should point out that I had been raised with guns ever since I was little, and so I knew how to properly handle one. I pulled out a 9mm and loaded it. I was going to scare this person off. I told my brother to lock the door behind me. Before I could even give him the chance to argue, I was marching to the door, gun in hand. I threw it open and stepped out onto the porch. My brother then flicked on the outside lights. Right there, 8 feet in front of me, was a sickly thin guy, wearing a hoodie with light blue eyes and a soul patch on his chin. He had been in the process of stepping onto the porch, but the moment he saw me, he spun around and ran like a bat out of hell. I took off running a few yards after him, then stopped and pointed my gun in the air. I fired off a shot. "That's right, fuck off, bitch!" I cried out. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before turning around to face the house. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that for a few moments, my heart basically stopped. I felt that momentary wave of ice water through my veins and the painful thudding of my heart in my chest. There were at least 8 other people standing around my porch, a handful more scattered around the yard. They were mostly men, but there were also at least 2 women, all dressed in dark jackets and hoodies, looking like they were in their early 20s at most. None of them said anything. Instead, they all just stared at me, their hands in their pockets. I couldn't tell if any of them had weapons on them. They all just scattered in a split second. Some jogged away, others walked off in different directions, all out into the woods. I legitimately forgot for a handful of moments that I had a gun on me until I raised my hands to my face and felt its weight. I sprinted back to the front door and pounded on it until my brother let me back inside. Honestly, I had no idea what to tell him. I had just fired a gun up into the air, and none of them had reacted or made any sound whatsoever. Had they been drunk or something and were trying to pull a prank, they would have at least said something, right? You know, something like, "Whoa, sorry man, wrong house, put down the gun." But all they did was stare at me, like I had just ruined their surprise attack, like they were more disappointed than scared. Then they all just wandered off. I had no idea what to make of it. My brother turned on all the lights in the house and called the cops, who to their credit arrived within 10 minutes and swept the perimeter. There were footprints everywhere. They asked my brother and I numerous times if we'd just had a party. I kept telling them that a dozen or more strangers had just started loitering around our house in the darkness, but the cops didn't seem to take that very seriously. They asked if the strangers had threatened us, and I had to admit that they didn't do so in any way. They confiscated the handgun after I told them I'd fired off a round, but they eventually did return it. I have no idea to this day what those people were doing that night outside our house. My brother suspects they were part of some kind of cult, maybe setting up to perform some kind of ritual. Maybe we were set to be human sacrifices. I thought it was much more likely they intended to break in and rob us, but saw the gun and bailed. That doesn't really explain the silence, though. None of them so much as uttered a sound as they looked at me. That group of people never returned, and I haven't caught a glimpse of anyone I recognized from that night in town. We bought a dog not long after. This happened in late 2015. I was working as a graphic designer for a very small startup company in rural New York State. It was just 4 of us in a rented building that the owner shared with a computer repair shop. I was the only female there, which I was perfectly fine with. Everybody was a nice group of geeky sweethearts. I'd been there maybe a month or so and worked closely with the web programmer. He was a young fella, around 23 or so, a real gentle giant type, tall and muscular, with tattoos and a shaved head. Super sweet and laid back though. We'd often take smoke breaks and shoot the shit together. I didn't really know much about his home life though, other than that he'd just moved in with his new girlfriend. She'd usually pick him up after work, but if she worked late, he had to walk home by himself along the highway in the dark. When we found this out, the boss immediately started offering him lifts home. I wondered what his situation was. Lost car or license? I didn't want to put him on the spot and ask though. He was kind of a shy guy. Anyway, time passed by, and one day the boss wasn't in, so I offered to drive him home instead. His rental was a small house behind a boarded-up car wash in the boonies. You had to drive down a short, dark, private road to get to it. You never even would have known the place existed were you just to be driving by. We shot the shit for a minute in the car and finished our smokes. I told him I'd see him tomorrow, and that's when things started to get weird. He looked at the house for several seconds, quiet, not moving to open the door at all. He said yeah in this strange, resigned voice, then slowly turned his head to look at me. Now, you have to realize that in real life, people almost never slowly turn their head to look at you. You can't imagine how creepy it is until someone actually does it to you. Add in the fact that I was a 120-pound woman and he was a huge guy. In a parked car behind an abandoned car wash in the pitch black with no other house in sight. This was not the kind of look a guy gives you after, say, a first date when they want a kiss or something. It was off, not an awkward or shy kind of off. He looked at me in the kind of way you look in your cupboard when you can't decide what to do, or if you should be eating anything at all. He was staring at me straight in the face, with this big squint, as if struggling hard to decide something. It was me who was the thing in this situation. That sudden shift out of nowhere to being looked at like a thing, not the amiable coworker he'd been laughing and bullshitting with and getting to know over the past month, scared the shit out of me. In less than a minute, he'd gone from his normal self into a state of tense and dissociated slow motion. I asked if he was okay. After maybe a minute or so, he looked back to the house, then sighed and said yeah before stepping slowly out of the car. Needless to say, I did not plan on giving him any more rides. A week later, it didn't matter anymore though. He blew his brains out with a shotgun on the front porch of that rental. His poor girlfriend was inside waiting for him to finish his cigarette. It was then, from his family, that we finally got the backstory. He'd been a newly sober alcoholic with DUIs from earlier in the year, which explained the no-car situation. He'd had several serious injuries from car wrecks and blackouts over the years, the last actually resulting in 2 permanent dents in his skull. The buildup of brain injuries had done far more than sobriety could reverse. His girlfriend admitted that ever since his last accident, he'd had intrusive violent fantasies and impulses that he'd never experienced before, visions of wanting to kill others and himself. You can imagine how I felt after remembering his behavior that night. It was certainly my creepiest personal experience, though when I think of it today, all I can really feel is sorrow from that poor man who'd barely started his life. In the end, he was strong enough to fight off the demons demanding others' lives, but he was unable to fight off his own. So yesterday, I went to the supermarket to pick up some groceries for my mama. It was around 6 p.m., I think. My sleep schedule was absolutely fucked up at the time, so I had just woken up and immediately left on my journey to the grocery store. You know when you're tired and driving so you're not really thinking about anything, and you're really just focused on getting there? Well, I wasn't really focusing all that much. At the stop sign you need to stop at before you make the turn into the supermarket though, I suddenly noticed there was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was standing all alone. This neighborhood was one of those that everybody knows. Quiet, not even a single robbery had ever occurred there, one of those types of neighborhoods. I assumed this child was walking home from a friend's house or something. I continued with my duty. After picking up the groceries, the kid was now in the parking lot of the grocery store. At this point, I was somewhat concerned about him. First, I walked to my car and put away my items in the trunk. Once I had them all firmly secured, I turned around to check on the boy again. I saw him standing with a lady wearing shades and a cap. Keep in mind it was 7 p.m. and it was dark out now. The shades were kind of a strange choice. Maybe it was someone the kid knew though. I was about to turn back around when I saw the kid shake his head and the woman try to grab his arm. "Hey!" I started walking towards them, and the woman spotted me. She immediately began to run away. I asked the boy if he was okay, and he said he had been waiting for his big brother to pick him up from the park. Turns out his brother had forgotten. It also turns out I actually knew his brother personally. I called him up and told him to pick up his brother right now and quit being an idiot. Anyway, who that woman was or what her intentions were, I have no idea. I like to think I helped that boy out that day though.